Welcome to today's Explainer. We are unpacking some incredibly useful source material all about qualitative research. Look, if you've ever felt completely overwhelmed by the sheer weight of research methodologies, you are absolutely in the right place. Today, we're going to explore generic qualitative research and actually build out a practical toolkit together. Our shared goal here is to make qualitative research accessible, practical, and highly manageable, no matter what kind of project you're tackling. Okay, let's dive right in. Do you really need a grounded theory for your course project? Let me guess. You're looking at a single semester thesis timeline. Your stress levels are rising, and you're staring down the barrel of intimidating methodological commitments, like, prolonged ethnographic fieldwork or complex theoretical sampling. You might be dreading it, but here's the really good news derived directly from our source material. You might not need to do any of that. Your time constraints are completely valid, and there is a rigorous, deeply respected path forward that doesn't require you to invent a brand new theory just to pass your course. So, here is our game plan for today. We'll start with understanding generic qualitative research, then compare generic versus name traditions, explore the qualitative research toolkit, tackle coding and data management, and finally walk through a step-by-step procedure. All right, let's jump straight into part 1. Understanding generic qualitative research. Before we get into the actual nuts and bolts, we really need to reframe how we think about this term. Choosing a flexible approach is a strategic choice, not a deficient one. Generic qualitative research, which is sometimes called basic qualitative research, is a flexible, pragmatic approach. It borrows the absolute best principles of qualitative work, like studying people in natural settings, using inductive analysis, and focusing on participants' meanings. But it does all of this without committing to the massive theoretical and procedural apparatus of a specific tradition. Our sources point out that simple, descriptive, interpretive questions, like how do these teachers understand X, are extremely common in applied linguistics and graduate theses. You aren't trying to describe an entire culture, right? You just want to understand how people experience a specific phenomenon. Recognizing this as a legitimate, standalone design is a really crucial methodological literacy skill. So, what does a generic qualitative study actually look like in the wild? Well, our sources outline a few core features. First off, you use purposive sampling, meaning you purposefully select information-rich participants who can actually speak meaningfully to your specific research question. Second, you rely heavily on semi-structured interviews, which are often your primary data source. Third, you perform inductive, thematic analysis to find those underlying patterns. Fourth, you maintain a laser focus on participants' perceptions and experiences rather than forcing their answers through a specific theoretical lens. And finally, your results are presented as theme-organized findings. It smartly borrows qualitative principles without all that heavy theoretical baggage. Moving right along to Section 2, Generic versus Name Traditions. To truly understand the boundaries of generic qualitative research, we have to compare it against the heavy hitters of the research world. Grounded theory, for example, requires theoretical sampling, constant comparison, and building a full explanatory theory. But you'd choose generic instead if your goal is just description, not building a brand new theory. What about ethnography? Well, that requires prolonged immersive fieldwork within a culture-sharing group. But if you're dealing with time or access constraints, generic is the way to go. Phenomenology demands a tightly shared single experience and very specific philosophical analytic methods, whereas generic is perfect when participants' experiences are related but not perfectly identical. And finally, case study looks at a single, clearly bounded case studied holistically. Generic research, on the other hand, is chosen when your question spans many individuals rather than just one bounded case. See, generic isn't a lesser version of all. It's the absolute perfect strategic choice for a specific type of descriptive goal. Okay, on to Section 3. This is a fun one, the Qualitative Research Toolkit. Consider this a rapid-fire unboxing of the Researcher's Toolkit. Now that we know what generic research actually is, selecting and designing these practical instruments carefully is absolutely essential for trustworthy data. You've got your interview guide for consistent conversations, an observation protocol for structuring the behaviors you witness, audio and video recorders to capture verbatim speech and tone, field notes templates for real-time descriptive notes, a reflective journal to track your own decisions, a document or artifact log to manage existing texts like essays or policies, coding software, often called CAD-DAS, to organize large datasets, and finally, a member-checking protocol, which is basically a structured process to return your interpretations to participants to confirm you got it right. Poor tool design is a primary reason qualitative studies underperform, so knowing this toolkit is literally half the battle. Let's zoom in on the most common tool, the interview guide. Designing this requires a real sense of forward momentum. Step 1, start broad, then narrow. Give your participants time to settle in with easy questions before diving into the sensitive stuff. Step 2, use neutral wording. You want to avoid leading questions like, "Don't you agree that?" Step 3, build in probes. Prepare natural, non-leading follow-ups like, "Can you tell me a little more about that?" Step 4, and this is absolutely crucial, pilot the guide. Test it with people similar to your target participants before the real data collection even starts. And step 5, sequence logically. Create a natural conversational arc from the warm-up to your core questions right down to a closing reflection. Our sources provide a really helpful worked example of how this all comes together in reality. Imagine a researcher asking, how do international graduate students experience a shift to academic writing expectations at an English medium university? The researcher drafts a 12-question interview guide and pilots it with one student. That pilot reveals a confusingly worded question, which they instantly fix. Alongside those interviews, they also collect one piece of past instructor feedback from each participant as a secondary document. They record the interviews, transcribe them, and finally use coding software to tag recurring ideas. By combining a piloted interview guide with collected documents, they ensure their findings reflect the full, rich data set, not just the most memorable quotes. Which brings us to Section 4, Coding and Data Management. Collecting the data is one thing, but making sense of it, that's the next crucial phase. Let's look at manual coding versus software-assisted coding, or CAQDS, like NVivo or MaxQDA. Think of this as a scaling metaphor. You really don't need a sledgehammer to crack a nut. Neither approach is inherently more rigorous. Manual coding is free, has practically zero learning curve beyond the analysis itself, and is absolutely perfect for small studies, usually under 10 participants. But if you have a larger study, CAQDS becomes a total lifesaver. It allows for instant, searchable retrieval of every excerpt under a code across massive data sets. Yes, it does require time to learn and usually a paid license, but it scales beautifully for bigger projects. To really bring coding to life, let's look at exactly what a codebook entry looks like, straight from our source material. Here's a code called Confidence Protecting Correction. Notice it has a crystal clear definition, withholding or softening error correction to protect a student's willingness to keep speaking. And most importantly, it includes an actual example excerpt from the data. I'll let a small grammar mistake go if I can see she's finally getting comfortable talking. Creating a codebook just like this shifts you seamlessly from vague theory into highly consistent, real-world practice. And here is a second example from that same source to drive the point home, code delayed correction. The definition states that the teacher deliberately notes an error to address later rather than interrupting immediately. And the example quote, I write it down and we look at a few common ones together at the end. Explicit definitions and excerpts exactly like these are what keep your analysis highly consistent, especially if you're working over a long project timeline or collaborating with multiple coders. All right, final stretch, Section 5, Step-by-Step Procedure. Let's systematically assemble this entire qualitative toolkit from start to finish. Here are your actionable steps. First, restate your research question in plain English just to confirm it genuinely calls for a generic qualitative approach. Second, choose your primary and secondary data sources to allow for triangulation. Third, draft your instruments, making sure to keep that wording neutral. Fourth, and our sources highly recommend this, pilot every single instrument while it's still cheap and easy to fix mistakes. Fifth, decide your recording and transcription conventions before data collection even begins so you aren't suddenly changing the rules halfway through. And sixth, select a data management approach proportional to your scale. A question that comes up all the time is, how elaborate does my toolkit actually need to be? The honest answer from our source is that your tool choice should scale with your study size and stakes, not with what looks most impressive on a proposal document. For a small study of, say, 8 participants or fewer, manual coding by a single researcher using a simple folder structure is highly rigorous and perfectly fine. But for a larger study of 15 or more, you'll definitely want CAD-DAS software, a formal codebook, potentially multiple coders checking for reliability, and a very structured data management plan. Before we wrap up, I have to issue some actionable warnings based on the common pitfalls identified in the text. Please do not treat generic qualitative as a lesser label. It is a widely used, deeply legitimate design choice. Never skip the pilot test. Ambiguous questions will absolutely ruin your real interviews. Don't rush out and buy expensive CAQDS software before it's actually needed for your study-specific scale. And whatever you do, avoid inconsistent transcription conventions. Changing how you mark a pause halfway through your transcripts will make later coding wildly unreliable. Avoid these pitfalls, and your study will be exceptionally rigorous and trustworthy. And that brings us to the end of today's explainer. Now that you have the practical toolkit, what fascinating descriptive question will you answer with your own generic qualitative study? You don't need a heavy philosophical apparatus to do meaningful, rigorous research. You just need clear questions, structured tools, and a sensible management plan. I hope this leaves you feeling confident, empowered, and incredibly eager to start designing your own research. Thank you so much for joining me today, and happy researching!